Welcome, everyone. So happy to have you all here. Thank you for coming to this SACA's first installment in our Lunch and Learn around restorative justice. I am so excited to have the panelists that we have here today. I'm going to go ahead and give a little bit of accessibility information. If you need, we've enabled captions. If you go down to the little 3 dots at the bottom of your Zoom screen and click more and click captions, you'll be able to see those on your screen. I've also highlighted or spotlit our ASL interpreters, Alina, there's 2 Alinas in the room now, and Jinah, and they will take turns every 15 minutes or so for ASL, for accessibility. If people have any questions, do you have any other needs, feel free to direct message me in the chat. But welcome, my name is Alina Santillan. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the director of Seattle Arts and Culture for Anti-Racism. I am actually in Seattle for less than 24 hours, which is maybe a surprise to probably everybody in the room, but I'm so grateful to be here. So my land acknowledgement will be for Coast Salish folks. I'd like to acknowledge that we live, work, and play in the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Muckleshoot tribes, and that we occupy this land. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but serves as this first step in honoring the land that we're on. Because we are in a mixed race space today, we also give a labor acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge that emotional labor is the need for one group to regulate their emotions to satisfy another group, usually the group holding the most power. We want to acknowledge the diversity present and not present in this cohort. This group is currently comprised of predominantly white folks, and white folks inherently hold more power in our current social system. We also want to recognize that the folks of color in this cohort are inherently carrying the abundance of emotional labor, both in this room and on a daily basis as they navigate the world, many of them navigating multiple systems of oppression. We thank and honor those that do the emotional labor and agree to not exploit it. We acknowledge the need to hold the weight of this emotional labor as a group. And it is a goal of this cohort for the folks that do not tend to hold the weight of emotional labor to accept the complexity and pervasiveness of the emotional labor. So just wanting to ask for people to be in agreement with that, to consent to hold this space in that way as we're in a mixed race collective. So we're gonna dive right in. I wanna first just thank all of the panelists. I am so glad you said yes to me, and was also just so excited, and also not trying to geek out that you said yes and that you're going to be here to share about your work. And I'm so honored that you're here. Dr. Bandhead has a commitment, a family commitment, and so I want to honor that. And so I'm gonna do a brief introduction for Dr. Bandhead, even though I could probably, I hope that's not weird, talk about you a lot, but I'm just so grateful to have you here. Dr. Bandhead is Executive Director of Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, RJOY, and is going to be talking a little bit about, I have some questions specifically for each panelist, but really wanted to touch base with you, Dr. Bandhead. First of all, just how would you define restorative justice and how it's connected to your work? And then more specifically, well, I'll let you answer that question first, and then I'll ask my follow-up.
Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here, and it's an honor and a pleasure. And so I'm just happy to connect with this community. So thank you, thank you. For a response to the question about how would I define restorative justice, I mean, we think about RJ as a worldview, not only a set of practices and principles, but an ethos, so kind of way of approaching living, not just harm, but how to build community, how to be at peace with ourselves, right? And how to be in a peaceful relationship with our environment. So I think about, restorative justice practices as the wellness and healing practices and principles that help guide those activities and actions. And so it's very, very broad for me, and I think for the ways in which we at RJOY think about restorative justice. And so we kind of often will ask the question of, is that restorative? Like whatever is going on, right? In terms of how are we going to respond to, this harm or this pain or this suffering or even this conflict, or even just like how we're going to be with ourselves. Are we being restorative in a healing and wellness kind of promotion way? So, I mean, I could spend a lot of time on RJ, but that's like it in a nutshell, that we feel like, that I feel, and I would say the organization, we often feel like that's kind of what people need to hear, that piece of it.
I really appreciate you bringing that into light of it being like a way of being, not just something that will go through this RJ process, and it's something separate from the way in which we're trying to engage with the world around us. One of the things that I wanted to I was really curious to hear your perspective is, I know RJ's pilot program that you were doing within the school district reduce suspensions, it interrupt that racialized school to prison pipeline. It eliminated violence so much in a way that it led to the Oakland School District adopting restorative justice as an official policy. And I'm just curious if you could share a little bit, maybe what the challenges that you maybe initially faced in moving that program or advocating that program. Were people resistant? If they were, what were their concerns, and how did you address that? Because I know within this sector, within the arts and culture sector, and with some of our organizations, there is a little pushback between doing something that is outside of the traditional model of human resources or conflict resolution. We don't really see that. So I'm just curious what your experience was there.
Yeah, so please remember that Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth began about 17 years ago. So those initial studies that you're talking about and that people know so much about have to do with, the very beginning, right, for us. And at the time, we were the first program, likely. I mean, it appears that we were the first here in Oakland, introducing these practices and principles. And I think our city was really kind of just looking for solutions to the conflict and to the violence and to the just discontent within schools. We were careful not to select schools that were the most challenging or that had the highest rates of violence, nor were we interested in the ones that had the lowest rates either. We wanted something kind of in the middle, and we wanted environments where there were critical masses of people of color, of BIPOC folks, and of people who are from kind of underrepresented communities, LGBTQ communities, low income, communities, Indigenous people communities, in part because we just knew about and we lived the experience of more marginalization. And so it was like within that context that we approached the work. And then we found partners, and it was deeply relational. It still is. All these things are still true. But I'm saying all that to say we didn't have a whole lot of resistance. There really wasn't a big, challenge personally. I mean, in terms of the experiences that our organization had. Yes, we helped to organize around, to abolish willful defiance as a condition on which people could be suspended and expelled from school. And it was the most common reason, right? And we knew that was more about the feelings of the teachers and the cultural mismatch between teacher and student, more than it really was about a threat to the safety, of others. And so, anyway, it was within that context, I think, that we began our work. And we are also in the home of the Black Panther Party. We are, the place where there's a lot of progressive thought, I would say, and at least liberal, if not progressive thought around community building and around, disciplinary practices. And so, again, I think that Oakland was kind of open for change to the city and the schools. And there was, and I think there remains, an interest in kind of restorative, even though people didn't at the time understand what those concepts meant, really. They just knew that an eye for an eye doesn't get it done, right? Like that's not the answer. And so there was an openness and a rightness for this. There still is, a woman, a white woman, her name was Jen Angel, was recently murdered, or she was killed, maybe not, she was killed in a botched robbery where she held on to something and was dragged by a car, and then she passed away. And so her family, this white family, this is actually in the news right now, her family has asked for a restorative process rather than a punitive one, rather than the people who caused this having, being prosecuted by the district attorney's office. The district attorney is interested in working with us on a restorative justice unit within the district attorney's office. So I guess what I'm saying is it's a cultural shift that we kind of help to usher in, and it's at all levels, not just within the school system, and not only in community, but also in the carceral system and in criminal and legal, institutions throughout our city. So I say all that to talk about our unique stuff. And then I would say specifically or broadly, we have done work all over the country, all over the world, honestly. And we know about the typical challenges. So I think that's the question you really want to ask me. So I will respond to that, which, there often are. So one thing that happens all the time is that there's this belief by teachers and by school systems and by institutions that if someone causes harm, then they should be harmed, even though folks won't always, agree to that. If you ask them, right, someone is harmed, should they be harmed? But that's a part of the punitive socialization that we all have. So how do you challenge teachers and administrators and leaders in schools to reevaluate that, to really kind of challenge the assumptions about how we heal? And so I would say that that's the big challenge, is making that shift. So what we always say is it's the adults that we have to work with first. So it's the teachers and the administrators, the security staff, if a school has that, the lunchroom staff, the volunteers who are adults, who will undermine and interrupt a restorative justice approach, a whole school restorative justice approach, because they believe that there's not enough accountability if there's not harm. So they equate harm with accountability and can't imagine a system, a world where there is high accountability and high support, and we're not harming people because they've been harmed, right? And so that's one thing, like making that shift. One challenge is the assumptions about accountability. And then another is the role of adults and the shift that needs to happen for the adults in schools and in school districts to really accept a restorative approach. There's a way that teachers often don't feel like they have enough time. They feel like this is an added burden, right? They don't see it as the opening of possibilities and lessening of the burden. So, for example, I went to Hull, England, which is the first restorative city in the modern era on the planet. And I say in the modern era because these practices are indigenous practices that have been practiced for thousands of years by many, many cultures around the globe. And we want to honor, of course, the original, kind of people who practice restorative practices and didn't get acknowledged or the credit for it. But in the modern era, in Hull, England, all of the schools have restorative justice as their kind of adopted practices. And so does the criminal legal system in all institutions, the child welfare, the mental health system. And so visiting those schools, what we saw is every single day, every morning, the adults came together in circle with each other before they go to the classrooms, where they come together with all the students every day in every class. And what they say is that it doesn't take more time. It actually creates more time, because if you have a relationship with the students in your classroom and with your adult colleagues, that when people are suffering, when someone has a special doctor's appointment, or when there's been a fight in the home or something the night before, or there's substance abuse or whatever's going on, the children can like let that out. They can be seen fully for who they are and honored, and then you can get on with the work, right? And so it actually doesn't take more time, but it takes less time, because the students who don't have an opportunity for that are then disruptive or hurting or struggling even more throughout the day. So those are some of the challenges that we're aware of that, come up over and over again. It has to do with adults in school systems and their need for their own, shift in assumptions. Another issue has to do with accountability and assumptions about accountability, that accountability means harm, and people can't imagine. They need to, be in circle enough to see the healing, to feel the healing possibilities of what a restorative justice circle high feels like, right? So that they become believers, and they then want that to be available to youth. And I forgot the last one that I just talked about. But anyway, those are two that come up over and over again. Yeah.
I appreciate, gosh, you shared so much wisdom. I'm so glad that we're recording, and for a second we stopped and got back caught up. And then would you acknowledge that like that process is, I would imagine it's not linear. I would imagine that sometimes people still have this maybe need for retribution. Sometimes that's not theirs. I know that's shown up for me sometimes when when I've witnessed harm happen, and I've had to really question, where's that coming from? That need for me to want someone to be punished, or maybe it's not punishment, but I want there to be some kind of acknowledgement or accountability. Would you say it's not linear, that people kind of like it's constantly a growth mentality of embodying restorative justice as a practice?
Absolutely. I mean, all of us, like all the RJOY staff, we're constantly challenging ourselves to be radically honest. So that means kind of interrogating what the true feeling is that arises. And we have several staff members who are formerly incarcerated, people who have caused great harm, some who have taken lives. And so that is really powerful, and a lifelong kind of journey for people for in themselves and for others who love them to come to terms with the relationship between accountability and forgiveness, honestly. And so depending on how we've all been raised, the people tend to regress to assumptions that they've been raised with, right? And so that's natural, I think. And it's also important for us to challenge that. So to be in a community where we can ask questions, of each other, and we can challenge ourselves to say, oh, why do I feel like this isn't enough, right? Or, we also challenge is this true accountability? Just because a young person says, I'm sorry, doesn't mean that they're really deeply accountable, right? So it's not just a set of boxes to check off to say, oh, this person wrote a victim impact statement and they gave a deep apology, and so we as a community have come together and agreed that now the harm has been accounted for. Like, it is a deeper, more nuanced, and more kind of art-based, I would say, healing. It's not just about saying words, but deeply, deeply feeling them and having them be felt by the people who've been impacted. And sometimes that's really, it doesn't land in the way that we need it to, right? So I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think sometimes I've been in spaces where I have felt shame for being like, oh my gosh, it feels like maybe people are a little further ahead of me on their understanding or practice of restorative justice. And there's something like not good about me because I'm not over here yet as I'm growing and learning and really thinking about like when I say words like justice or accountability, like what does that mean? What does that look like? And I think as I've evolved and stretched and grown, my experience with harm, whether it's harm that's happened to me or that I've witnessed, is that um, true justice for me doesn't feel like I don't know that I would get true justice or accountability for harm by having someone just removed from community and there not being a process where we grapple together, where it's like the person that has been harmed is centered, but we're also going to believe in your capacity as the person who's caused it to take ownership and to show up in different ways. And I appreciate you sharing that, because I've heard other people have experiences of that too, where people get defensive, like, well, that's not what I think. And then it kind of shuts down this conversation for exactly what you're talking about.
Right, right. I mean, what we always think about is that it's not, well, I think that the goal is healing, right? The goal is true healing by all parties, right? As much as is possible. And we heal in different ways. And so some people just, I think, I don't know if it's naturally, but some people, because of their personalities, are higher on accountability or higher on support. Right. And we notice that on certain issues that people can be higher on accountability and higher on support. There's this way in the restorative justice community of peacemakers, you know, these are who are peacemakers engaged in these processes, that there's, I would say, an assumption that to be high on support is the optimal way of being. And this whole issue of accountability, yes, it's important to, you know, by definition, restorative justice is high accountability and high support, but it's more high support that we value. And this accountability thing may feel punitive no matter what it is for some people, right? I personally am an RJ practitioner who's high on accountability. Like, accountability really matters, not punishment, but accountability. And so let's like grapple with that issue of how do we have true deep accountability that's not shaming, that's not about punishment, but that's about real deep accountability, and while having the support that's needed too. And I think, you know, as a society, that means more resources, it's more costly, you know, takes more time, it depends on authenticity and vulnerability of the parties. So, but yeah, I think we're at RJOY, we're often thinking about these issues and talking about them. I only have a few more minutes, but I would love to share some images. As we're talking, it's making me think, I have some images about our work, and I'm happy to share them with you guys. Just quickly, briefly, just, you know, run through it, because I don't know. May I do that?
Please, please.
I'm going to show you just some of the work that we do, right? So this is just me with my hair is curly, and a little bit about our mission, which we use restorative justice practices, but it's all focused on increasing mental wellness, you know, mental health and wellness. And our focus has really been on underrepresented communities and BIPOC communities. And then this is our context of a city that has a lot of violence and marginalization and sexual and commercial and sexual exploitation and incarceration. And we're also where Silicon Valley, you know, the borders of Silicon Valley have shifted to encompass our city, and the cost of living is among the highest in the country and the world, you know, so this is the context of our practice. And we work in these four major areas around reducing recidivism and related trauma, in that interruption of the school to prison pipeline and increasing wellness. We also do a lot of work around racial healing and reparations and truth telling, community restorative justice, and training and consultation education. So again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I just want to quickly go through it to show you some of the images. We publish, we write, because we feel like it's important to move the kind of critical analysis and conversation forward. We also create infographics to kind of communicate the impact of criminalization. And then we are funded by different entities to focus on different areas, all using restorative justice practices. These are some of our circles in Chicago at the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice Conference this summer, and in our office and in our farm. This is like an advertisement for some of our African-American healing circles, and some focus, every week we have like 10 of them. And this one, we have like queer and trans people of color circle, and elder circle, and formerly incarcerated people circle, and youth circle, and Black male circle. This is one of the circles in our office, and another one. And also work that we do in schools around interrupting violence. And we do some work that is responding to harm in community. So if people don't want to call the police, they can call us at 888 RJ Cares, and we will intervene like in the moment to help people using restorative practices, if as a way to stay safe outside of the carceral system and the mental health system. So it's a warm line, not a hot line. But some of the stuff we do. This is a training of all Black male circle keeper training at our office. And we do a lot of work on mental health, mental wellness. This is a Black to yoga at our office. So people just came in the weekend for yoga. That's our farm on the left, some of our baby trees that we planted. We do international work. This is our global brochure, us in South Africa, learning from getting divination and learning from traditional sangomas and healers. Us with working with women around female genital mutilation in Kenya with some Maasai people. We're taking 30 people to Ghana in July this year to learn about peacemaking and alternative dispute resolution in these indigenous contexts in Ghana. And then our youth at our own youth internship program at our farm. So this is our farm, which we open up to our partners for free to visit. This is the outside of it and the inside of it, and our deck. And all of this is fairly new for RJOY. It's been in the last 2 years that we purchased the farm. We also purchased a building, a restorative justice hub. And this is our youth at the farm, though, planting and growing. And that's our new building in downtown Oakland. And our new Credible Messenger program, which is in for people with youth in custody in juvenile hall, doing restorative justice practice, coaching and mentoring and counseling, as well as life planning and financial literacy work with people in custody. So that's it. That's all I wanted to share. I know I went through it super quickly, but I just thought I'm here with you too, with you guys. And I wanted to just give you, a taste of some of the work that we do.
Dr. Bandhead, thank you so much for being here and for all of that. Like, I'm now even more excited, and I'm like, don't leave. But I'm sure, I know our paths will cross again. If there's anything you want to share with me after, I'm happy to send it out to folks. But I'm just so grateful for your time today.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I'm so happy to have had the opportunity to be here with you. And please invite me back. I'd love to talk to you. Anyone, you're welcome to reach out to me directly. You can at Teiahsha at RJOY Oakland.org. I'm putting it in the chat. That's just my first name at RJOY.org. You can also send anything to RJOY at RJOY.org. Because I get all of those emails, and I will either answer it myself or send it to another staff member. Or if you want to reach another staff member, you can send that to me and I'll forward it to them. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm sorry I can't be here longer. It's a family commitment to a special evening with my daughter. So.
Family's important. Thank you again so much. So grateful.
Thank you. Bye now.
Good night. So I'm like, now I'm just really fired up. Now I can't contain my excitement anymore, and I'm not going to. That was amazing. We will definitely have Teiahsha back here. I'm excited to introduce our other panelists. I don't think anybody will be upset, Martina, if a puppy does interrupt you, but if you would rather keep your camera off, that's also okay as well. And Whitney and Clara, you can camera on or camera off, whatever feels most comfortable to you. But I thought we would dive in a little bit further in our panel. So I want to spend a little more time introducing these folks because we have the time. So Whitney Aguilar, she, her pronouns, from Centinela Youth Services in LA. And I'm super excited. Whitney and I had a chance to connect before this panel. And I think we were both like, we both have to go back to work now. Like it was just such a good conversation. And we were just happy to be in community together and talking about this work. And, you know, the collective of people here are all representatives from mostly arts and culture organizations. And I think sometimes when people are thinking about restorative justice, they think about criminal justice. They think there's not a lot of how can we apply these RJ principles to our work in the arts and culture sector. And I think specifically in Seattle, you know, we have a lot of orgs that are, here are our commitments. Like we're working to be an anti-racist organization or an intersectional organization, hopefully both. Here are the things that we're doing. But there's still this element that I feel like is missing and that people have a lot of discomfort around, and that is harm is going to happen. We're all human. I'm going to cause harm. You're going to cause harm. And if we can take a deep breath and just, I think, acknowledge that, I think it'll allow us to get to a place where we can come up with a process or build on a process that's already been gifted to us that allows us to address harm internally in our orgs, externally when harm happens. Maybe it's our organization has caused harm to a community or a community member. And I think traditionally we've been like, no, that didn't happen. Like kind of the gaslighting, like, well, that wasn't our intention, rather than, yeah, that was racist or that was transphobic and that wasn't our intention, but that was our impact. And here are the ways that here are ideas we have to make amends. How does that feel for you? Do you have different needs? And I'm just curious, like, to hear from each of you. And Whitney, this first question is for you, but I know CYS, restorative justice centers, serve youth and families through a trauma-informed lens. And I'm curious if you could talk about what trauma-informed care is and how it relates to restorative justice.
Sure. Thank you so much, Alina. And I just wanted to acknowledge I'm super happy to be here, excited. I loved what Teiahsha had shared so far with RJOY. So related to trauma-informed care, I think I saw it in one of Teiahsha's slides. It's hurt people, right? Understanding that while an restorative justice process might be working towards resolving one particular instance or incident of harm and hurt or a crime that has occurred, some sort of offense, understanding that there are layers to folks, right? So trauma-informed care is trying to see someone for their whole self, not just that particular instance of harm or hurt that was caused. So what's going on beneath the surface? What are the underlying needs or unmet needs that might have led to or caused some of that harmful behavior in the first place? What are the root causes, and how can we collectively both identify, be open and honest about what's going on beneath the surface, but then collectively hearing each other and finding some sort of solution or pathway towards healing that's going to meet those underlying needs so that that harmful practice, harmful behavior doesn't continue to occur, right? So it's not just, let's treat this instance of hurt, harm, conflict, however you want to describe it, but how do we repair the whole dynamic, restore the whole dynamic, all parties involved, the community, so that we're all in a better place, whatever that might look like, to prevent further hurt and harm. So it's a little bit of intervention that leads to prevention of future conflict and harm. Another thing that I wanted to share about trauma-informed care is, so CYS, we work with young folks, typically in a diversion context, so trying to interrupt the next step in a legal case for youth that have committed harm, whether that's a theft, vandalism, assault, battery, all sorts of situations. Working with youth, understanding just basic development is important, right? So brain development, there's so much research that's come out around, well, we know that kids are different than adults, but fundamentally within brain science, it's showing that the mechanisms in our brains, the attachments between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, not fully developed yet. So understanding that typical youth development may be leading to hurt and harmful behavior. Beyond that, the role that trauma plays in hurtful and harmful behavior, that somebody who is experiencing trauma, whether that's on an individual level, within their family, within their neighborhood, larger community, trauma leads us to have heightened levels of toxic stress. We're in a constant state of hypervigilance. We're not able to concentrate effectively. We can't sleep well. We might have more exaggerated or mismatched emotions depending on the situation at hand. And that leads us to feel like we need to protect ourselves, to respond to a perceived threat or a real threat. And that's a very real part of when we're talking about wanting to restore relationships or repair harm. We can't pretend like we're just addressing this one instance of harm or conflict, that there are so many layers, and just us as human beings, trauma plays a role in it. We need to ask questions of what's going on, what has happened to you, what are your needs, how can we help? Those are restorative questions.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Winnie. I don't, my experience from, or an experience in harm, and bringing that to like HR or, another pathway that was said, hey, if something happens, go to this person. I haven't had questions asked like that. Like, what would reclaiming your sense of safety require? Like, is relationship repair possible? Like, what do you need? I've never been asked those questions. And I don't think that those questions are just specific to RJ practice in criminal justice spaces.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Yeah, there are things that we can apply in other spaces, even in my personal life. Like I can think about times where I was like, well, that I didn't mean to. So like thinking about that person also is embarrassing. But I learned in that of like, my impact was different, and how was I willing to acknowledge that impact and hope that I'm not seen in just as the harm that has been caused, but as a full person. I really appreciate that trauma informed lens and that perspective.
For sure.
Martina.
I'm here, but I think it cut out and I couldn't hear the question.
Oh, I think it's because I muted myself.
It's okay.
Yeah, so I'm just grateful that that Martina can be here. She, her pronouns with Collective Justice Northwest. I was so excited that you also said yes. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was, I know you have a background in generative somatics, and that was something I actually wasn't super familiar with. And I'm curious to learn how you use that in your restorative justice work. especially with survivors of trauma and harm, of just like kind of what is generative somatics and how do you use that in your restorative justice work?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you for having me here. I feel really honored to get to share space with y'all. And yeah, I mean, that's a great question. There's folks in collective justice, Brianna, Stacy, Teddy are three of our facilitators I'm thinking of right now, who have many, many years in somatics practice that they bring to our work. My background in generative somatics is that of a student. So I'm not leading somatics work in our circles. I'm still learning, very much still learning sort of how to move away from my conditioning to be in my head, to intellectualize or verbalize instead of trusting the wisdom that my body holds. And so somatics for me, sort of like almost just like any other embodiment practice, is a way for me to drop into my own work, and so that I can come back feeling more connected, more on purpose, and more grounded in my restorative justice work. I work in cases primarily of serious violence and harm, and so I want to be sure that when I'm companioning people and walking with people alongside navigating really tremendous loss and trauma or messy accountability, that I'm getting out of the way, that I'm like not making it about me, that I'm not, that my own traumas aren't getting in the way of the stories that I'm being told. And so I sort of think about somatics as an opportunity for me to resource myself so I can come into the work in alignment with my values. And even just hearing you share about like that knee-jerk reaction that we sometimes have toward punishment, like we all experience that. And I brought survivors in to the prisons before and had them share stories. And so I'm thinking about a couple of conversations I've had with people who demonstrated this like profound grace in the face of really difficult conversations. And then later reflected to me like, man, that was a good day. And then 3 days later, I woke up thinking about like beating the person up who caused me harm. And boy, do I like continue to cycle and evolve through my own healing and my own evolution. And I think like that makes sense. We're not stagnant. And somatics work is part of that, right? It's part of like uprooting the logic of the state that does get embodied and lodged into all of us, not just intellectually, but in our own bodies, and allowing us to come home to a felt sense of belonging and of connection, and just to slow us down. So I think that answers that. So I don't teach somatics, but that's kind of how how it informs my work. And I also wanted to comment on something you said earlier, because I didn't know who all would be on the call, but incredible to hear that it's folks primarily in arts and culture. And I think restorative justice does get, like when we think about RJ, we think about these like programs that are in the justice system that are in schools. But RJ is like what everyone else has said before me. RJ is so much more than that. And to me, it's really this like dreamy prefigurative practice. And that's the part that I love the most. Like in that way, I think we are all creatives doing this work. And, like in the midst of state violence, of incredible trauma and oppression, folks find this anchor and this sort of lifeline in restorative justice and in their own knowing that we're sacred, despite all of the messages that were given to the contrary, that like we are sacred and we're going to fight like hell for the people who are in this circle with us, and who are in our communities. And so I think like when people get this real taste or this real feel of restorative justice, when you get to be in those spaces, I think like Dr. Bandhead was saying, like actually being in it, embodying in it, getting to witness it, then, when I see people have that experience, the sort of sense of dissatisfaction with the way that things are and the conditions that we live in become surpassed by a passion for what could be, and like a real fight and a yearning that we can feel in our bodies for what is possible on the other side. And that to me is the power of restorative justice. Like that's the magic.
I love so much of what you said, and also just acknowledging like the human nature, and Dr. Bandhead said the same thing too, like it's not linear practice, and there is a natural knee-jerk reaction of like, you did this thing and that was messed up, and I want to see you get punished for it. And I think I just lived in that space for so long and never questioned my need behind why, even if it was something that didn't happen to me. And then being in conversation with people and feeling shame because maybe this conversation was new to me. Like I didn't grow up learning about restorative justice. Like we're in the deep South. Do a crime, go to jail. Do a crime, do the time. It's like those are the commercials you see on TV. So it's just not that was never a concept that was introduced to me. And I've been so grateful to meet people who are willing to like hold grace and space for me to grapple with these concepts. And what you were sharing, I know you've done prison-based support work too, and I've had a privilege of working with the Black Prisoner Caucus in Washington and going up to Clallam Bay and sitting in circle with the Black Prisoner Caucus and hearing people share poems or stories or art forms. And then some of them would share the crimes that they committed. Some of them were like rape, some of them were murder. And then that was such a mind-blowing experience for me to have, because I was not seeing them as that. It was this opportunity to see someone as their full self. And it was just like you said, like that was life-changing for me. I had never experienced anything like that.
Yeah, that's such a powerful experience. And well, I feel like I didn't name this, I normally do, but the Black Prisoners Caucus BPC were one of the groups that helped start collective justice and invited us into the prison. And we're saying like, we want spaces to do our repair work and our accountability work. And, you know, when you're incarcerated, there's not a lot of resources and support for that. But like, that was a group of people who were sentenced to life in Washington saying, like, can we please have some support to do this like really deep, difficult work that we want to do, not because we need to, not because we have to, but that we want to do. And I came to RJ as a person who had been on both sides of harm. My first interaction with the criminal legal system was as a survivor. And very shortly after, when I was 20, I was a defendant facing 15 to life in the deep South. And with that, like, it comes like a mandatory sentence in federal prison. And so I fought my case with a public defender for many years. I got off supervision not that long ago when I was in law school. But my experiences, you know, as deeply traumatizing as they were absolutely paled in comparison to what I saw happening in the legal system to poor people and people of color every single day who are cycled through. And so I think it's also really important to name that, you know, like, restorative justice work it's healing work, it's interpersonal healing work, but it happens in the context of conditions of harm and violence that are targeted at communities of color, undocumented communities, queer people, and poor people. And like RJ, I think sometimes when we talk about it, you know, in the DA's office or in the Department of Corrections, can get watered down to this like program for individuals. I think it's really important to name that RJ at its best is very much an abolitionist project. That like we cannot stop interpersonal harm without addressing the conditions that make that harm possible to begin with. And so I just, as you said, BPC, I'm like, we got to talk about, you know, the necessity for freedom in order to do this work.
Thank you for naming that and for your vulnerability and sharing your story. And again, just as like a welcome for everyone here is like, we have all calls to harm. Like, we're human, that has happened. That's just a part of it. And I'm so interested and invested in like using the gift that has been given of restorative justice and that indigenous practice and applying that to our lives and making it a state of being. I never even thought to use that kind of language until Teiahsha shared that, of like, it's more of a state of being rather than this like thing that we do. before we have some more general like conversation, I wanted to pass it to Clara if she's ready. And full disclosure, I'm just so lucky to have Clara as a friend and to serve with you in just like other community spaces. I've like really known each other for a year, but I've already just learned so much from you and have been I'm always honored to share space with you. I've witnessed firsthand the care and intention that you put into cultivating safe spaces for people to fully show up. And I hope that that I am also able to share that as I've witnessed you do that. I think you and I are also unfortunately share a common experience of harm that has come from working within the nonprofit sector. And we've had conversations about what healing or repair could look like. And I'm curious, in your work as a facilitator, how have your own experiences informed the way that you mediate conversations between those who have been harmed and those who have caused harm? Because I didn't think about it until Martina said, like, when you're in spaces where with people that have experienced, like when you were talking about generative somatics, of like, how do you get out of the way a little bit? I never thought about in spaces, how's my own trauma and harm in the way of maybe someone else's restoration process. And so I'm just curious, Clara, if you can like just talk about like, how do you take those experiences in the way that you facilitate the spaces?
Thank you, Alina. What a wonderful question. And thank you for having me on the space. I'm going to try and accommodate my camera so that y'all can actually see me. And I'm going to name that I am so excited and so energized for this conversation. Like, my heart is going like this right now. I can feel my blood rushing to my head, and it's just so much joy and excitement. And you know, that's something that I actually learned to really hone in on and listen to and pay attention to during my time with collective justice. And I think that kind of just speaks to how somatics and really attuning to your own body can support you and guide you through difficult conversations. And let's be real, talking about restorative justice and abolition isn't an easy conversation to have, especially when we're continuously discouraged from having it. And within the nonprofit sector, that is so incredibly true. And, you know, full disclosure, I bring into this conversation my perspective of having over 15 years working within the sector. I have also been on a couple of boards. I'm currently sitting on a board right now. And so I bring a lot of different perspectives and understanding. And one thing that I always come back to is the imbalance that exists because of the power dynamics at play. And anytime I'm in conversation with somebody who's been harmed or has caused harm, I think about the imbalance. I think about the story and the actions that have taken place that are outside of the situation, because there's so much happening outside of the situation that impact us every single day in ways that we don't even recognize. And I personally feel that that's especially true within the nonprofit sector. And I personally, as you mentioned, have unfortunately experienced what that looks like. And, you know, to have walked away from that harm and have been able to survive to speak of it is so interesting to align with my abolition work, because at the end of the day, these structures have been put in place by the same powers that be and operate in incredibly similar ways, right? And so with that understanding of power, with that understanding of imbalance, and with the understanding and burden of harm that I have already experienced and witnessed throughout my time within the sector, it's imperative to move forward with the restorative justice mind frame at the forefront. And that's how I approach my work these days within the nonprofit sector. I don't feel like I work in the nonprofit sector, but I do a lot of work alongside the nonprofit sector because I personally believe it's one of many oppressive systems that needs to be abolished. I personally feel that there's a lot of harm that comes from the nonprofit sector that is very easily hidden away and, just kind of, brushed off as, just another day at work, right? But that comes at such a great cost. And it often comes at the cost of the employees who don't have the most resources, who don't have the most access, who don't have the closest relationships to leadership and the powers that be. And so they're often not heard. And having been that person and having been silenced, I recognize that one of the most powerful things that these systems can do to anybody is make them feel isolated and alone. And one of the powers of restorative justice is recognizing that you're not alone. That's why we come into the work with our full selves and we see each other for our full selves. And again, that's something that's just so easy to dismiss when we're living in a capitalist society that's constantly forcing us to keep moving. And so with that in mind, having conversations with others and trying to bring back that balance, it's so important to intentionally slow down, bring that awareness, not just to your own self, but to the space around you and tune into the people around you. I think it can be very powerful, but also equally very dangerous when we close ourselves off from our bodies and let our brains do all of the thinking, as opposed to letting our brains connect with our whole self and really take everything in. And what that looks like in a nonprofit sector, and really a lot of different sectors and areas of life, right? It's so important to slow down. It's so important to stop and take a step back to really see everything that is in front of you. And most importantly, to listen to the people in front and around you. And yeah, I feel like that's not something that the nonprofit sector is really excelling in right now, which is why you see so many, big nonprofits still operating the same way that they do, with these hierarchical structures that are very toxic. I mean, we still see a lot of people going back to 9 to 5, and we're still 3 years into this disastrous global catastrophe. But why? I'm digressing. So I'm going to pause right now and just let everything I threw out just kind of settle in. I hope it made sense.
It did make sense. And I love that. I feel like that should just be on a shirt, like, but why? Like, it's such a simple question that I feel in my body so much. Like, but why? I think about what were the creative things I did as a kid when I shoot, I know the ice cream man comes at like 3:30, but I don't have any money. My parents aren't home. I know I'm going to build like a little amusement game park in my yard and charge kids like 50 cents to like play these games I made. And then you know what? I got that ice cream. And it's like, at some point we've become adults. We've lost this ability, I feel, to dream and to like, where is that space that I lost, where I'm more hesitant to say no? And now I'm coming into the space, but why? I'm just going to quote you as like, that's something that Clara said, even though it's like 2 words. Like Whitney, Martina, I don't know if either of you have stuff that you want to elaborate on that. But if you don't, I have a question for you, Whitney.
I'll always have plenty to say. I try to be mindful of like when to step up and when to step back as well. So don't want to say too much. But I'm reminded of the fact that this is an arts and culture collaborative. And I really can't emphasize enough how creative restorative justice is. I think truly that's the embodiment of restorative justice compared to retributive justice, whether we are talking about a criminal system or the hierarchies and bureaucracy in different systems and institutions. Restorative justice is creative. It calls for us to open our minds and figure out what options are on the table, and then what's going to work best for those most involved in the conversation or most involved in the situation. It's not just, you broke this rule, so we need to apply this consequence. It's not a one size fits all. And I think that that's the unique space and the most magnificent opportunity that the arts and culture communities have to really like embody what restorative justice is. It's, let's peel back all the layers of, well, this is how we've done things for so many years, or this is you know, the most common or the most popular types of art and performance, but let's get creative in what our communities want and need to be able to repair relationships or create new relationships. I think that's also a unique component of restorative justice, that it's not just about how do we get back to the before, but how can we like grow into something new and better.
Yeah, I so appreciate that too. And I feel like sometimes there's like a lack of acknowledgement or like fear of acknowledging like, yeah, we did that, or we, you know, like we caused harm in this way, even though it was unintentional. Like there's a lot of fear of like admitting that. And I don't know if it goes to this legal thing of like, well, what if someone sues us, or what if someone puts something in the paper, or what? And personally, my experience with organizations that have been going through a process like that, those things don't happen when people are willing to take accountability, when they're willing to be like, I hurt you. Like that acknowledgement, like when I think about my own healing, like if I would have had any kind of like acknowledgement in that, that would have gone so far for me of just like, thank you for not gaslighting me and telling me that's not what happened to me, and just like listening to like, but this is my experience. And that I think would have been a much more healing process, or like what I imagine steps toward justice would look like. Yeah, and I appreciate like you sharing yeah, like the creativity that that restorative justice can be. That's not a, you know, like we don't have to have this accountability doesn't always have to mean punishment. It can look different, and then acknowledging also like our human need for like that's going to pop up. And Martina, what you said too about the BPC, about having people be like, that was a great day, and also I want to beat the crap out of this person 3 days later, and it not being this just straightforward process. Like if we're going to give grace to other people, like also remembering to give grace to ourselves. Martina, I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to share on what either of them said, but I wanted to make space for that too.
I'm open for questions.
Okay, I wanted to transition it, if it was okay, and have people, I will try to get to as many questions as we can. If you want to raise your hand, your virtual hand, so I see you, and then we can unmute, or you can put it in the chat if you don't feel comfortable speaking. That is also totally fine too. Having done workshops with therapists before, I'm also comfortable with quiet. And so if anyone's feeling uncomfortable, I'm not. So I will wait until there's some questions in the chat. I'm sure people have some, and I would love to hear some questions. Yeah, is it Tatiana?
Yeah.
Please.
I am so thankful to be here. I just wanted to say thank you for this panel and this conversation. I'm a theater maker and an educator, and it is so wonderful to hear these kinds of conversations happening around community, because I think that, you know, when we work with people, it's so important to take opportunities to get to know ourselves more deeply and invite others to join us on that journey. And I was curious for all of the panelists here today, what have been your experiences with like kind of managing like messy feelings, I guess. Like I think part of the work when we're in community with our students or with fellow artists is that, you know, there's a place where our personal biases, our own trauma, our own, like we were mentioning before, hurt comes into play. And I'm just wondering like how you manage that for yourself. Like what are some strategies you use, or like what are reminders that you give to your like collectives on how to sort of tune into those maybe like biases?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, who wants to go?
I can share a little. Oh, you were gonna go, Clara?
You can go first if you'd like.
I don't mind either way. I want to make sure, Tatiana, that I have your question right. So because it has like a couple of really rich questions inside of it. So correct me if I'm wrong or help guide me. But it sounded like you're interested in hearing about like how we hold messiness, messy feelings, complex, contradictory feelings as practitioners or people in the work. But also, did you also just mean like in general?
Yeah, definitely in terms of like when you're in circle with others, and in the midst of these conversations, like specifically, how do you hold that messiness?
Thank you. I have a couple of things that like immediately came to mind. And I think for me to be in restorative justice work is to be in messiness. Like you have to know that going in, and that's like why it's so juicy and fun and life affirming. Previous to coming to RJ, I felt like really bifurcated or like almost polarized. Like I worked in victim services, and then I worked in like abolitionist prison-based support spaces. And I think for me, it was really about like my own healing work in both of those experiences. And I didn't have a place that was holding questions about both. And so what I loved about restorative justice when I came into that space was the not just the willingness, but like the purpose is to sit in the messy nuance, like to sit in these complicated questions about, you know, how do we hold accountability and harm at the same time? How do we stop interpersonal violence and state violence at the same time? How do we have an equal dedication to the dignity and humanity of people on both sides of harm? Like that, those questions cause us to sit in contradiction. And so one of the things that's actually a somatics practice is to let yourself hold two opposing statements. And then instead of bouncing between them and feeling like disoriented by that, to like actually center and breathe and let yourself get wide enough to hold both, and to say like, I am big enough to hold both of these contradictions at the same time. I don't have to bounce back and forth. And so I think about that all the time in the work and like the big philosophical questions, but also in you know, in interpersonal stuff. Like sometimes you're in circle with somebody. I've done accountability work with people who I like didn't like, but I love because they're a human who's complicated and I want to support them. But like, it was hard, you know, when I see someone causing harm and, you know, I have in my own body complicated feelings about this and what it means to be supporting them through accountability work. And so I have to like actually practice that, like in the moment, in my own head, like take a breath, get wide enough, take a breath, get wide enough. Like this person has caused great harm and they're a human deserving of love and care. And so, yeah, I think that's how I think about it inside of myself. And then a couple of things I wanted to say more broadly is that I think that there's an inherent contradiction in our own work all the time. Like we do healing work and there's harm in CJ, right? Like when you have humans in a room, conflict will happen. And so also like being really humble and willing to like be rigorous about our own practices and how do we just like name it, say it out loud, be partners with one another to figure out how to solve it and repair when possible feels really, really, really important to me. Like if we're not walking it it doesn't mean perfection, but if we're not walking the messiness, then we're not doing the work. And so I think that that is like a constant evolution for us in a group. And the last thing I'll say is, it in the context of the work, I've had two instances that like really stick out to me of people who were really struggling with complicated feelings who I was supporting. One was a person who had lost her father to a murder, and we were preparing her for a dialogue to sit down with the person who took her father's life. And as we were preparing for that dialogue, some things came up in the person's life who had caused harm, just like basic human needs that weren't met, like housing issues. And he was reentering after 20 years in prison, 24 years in prison. And so was trying to find stable housing and a stable job. And so it took him longer to prepare for the dialogue than it took her. She had been really in her own work for a long time and was ready to talk. And so I remember her, like, she had so much grace. She wanted this dialogue because she wanted to offer forgiveness, which was so powerful. And it doesn't have to be what RJOY is about, but for her it was. And she came like from day one with like all this grace, all this love. And then about halfway through started being like antsy. She's like, what is taking so long? This person's been incarcerated 24 years. Like, what more work do they need? Shouldn't they be ready for this conversation? Aren't they ready to be accountable? And like started having some like sharpness and some real like anger, right? Like righteous anger about having to wait for this thing that she wanted to do, and feeling like, well, does that mean that we're centering the other person's process more than mine? And multiple times called me like pretty upset with me. And I think that, and then would call back the next day and say like, oh, I'm so sorry. And then call again, really upset. And I think that to me is just like a perfect example of the complex feelings that people are in and deserve, have every right to be in. And at the end of the day, we said to her, like, all of her inclinations were right. Like, she was right to be upset. She was right to want to have the process when she wanted it. It made sense. She was right to like demand that someone give her an update and check in with her. And it wasn't in line with her stated values, like both of those things are true at the same time. And that ended up being like such a huge part of the healing for everybody. The other one I'm thinking of is a young man who had taken life as a very, very young person. And when we were prepping him for accountability work, he said multiple times, like with a lot of defiance, I took someone's life and I would do it again. And when he said that in circle, people were very angry. And there was a lot of elders in the circle that like it caused tension, and sort of you could see like people escalating emotionally. And one of our facilitators said to him, like, that felt really hard to hear. And I'm really curious why you feel that way. Like, I'm just curious about why. And he said, well, I would do it again because the person who I harmed killed my loved one. And I was 11 and I witnessed it. And she just was like, wow, I cannot believe you've had to hold that all these years. I can't imagine what that must have been like. And then he like burst into tears. Circle ended, and we came back the next week and he was like, okay, I'm ready to do my accountability letter. Like, just like no prompting. And I think that's that like what in that, if you just took a still shot of that moment, it might seem like a huge contradiction that he got to say this harmful thing. And then we just held him as a survivor himself. But if you remember like the long arc of the work, then it's so much easier to have grace for those complicated moments, because you could trust the process and trust that someone might come back around and trust that you're planting the seeds. And that to me feels like that complicated thing is where the work happens. It's right where there's contradiction that the work happens. I think I over answered, but that's all the things that made me think about. Thank you for asking that question, Tatiana.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Ooh, that was like, I feel like we all just need to pause. Like, what a powerful, it makes me think of like how often Like, have any of us ever been held in that same way when we've been in contradicting spaces? And when I think about harm that has happened to myself and to other people, it makes me a little emotional to think about what you just, like that last story you just shared, because there was no restoration process for me. There was no accountability process. And it was just, and has been rooted in anger only, where I haven't even been able to get to that space that you just shared. And that I think we've all heard is like, hurt people. That's not an excuse to like continue to cause harm. But I hope that example is like, is opening people to receiving that and to thinking about that differently. Thank you for sharing that. Clara, I know that you wanted to share some. If you do, you don't have to. You can pass it to Whitney. Yeah, Whit.
Uh-oh. Just on the topic of managing messy feelings, that is restorative justice. I really want to echo what Martina has shared on those beautiful examples of messiness, and to encourage folks that are maybe new to restorative justice or uneasy about it to not shy away from the messiness, to at least be willing to show up, I think is a key component of restorative justice, being willing to show up and to hear what others have said, and to know that you're going to have your space to have your story shared as well, or whatever you choose to share, but that understanding that we're all in this and willing to show up. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if we're going to, reach some sort of great outcome or good outcome, or just be okay with the fact that we've all shared our side of the situation. But restorative justice is about showing up.
Yeah, I love that, what you shared, Whitney, and that being a really important part of RJ is like, both people have to show up. And, this, Whitney, maybe you can like kind of launch off of this comment. I'd love to hear from everybody, but, and also just to acknowledge, like Michelle had put in the chat, do you know, and Martina, and I think maybe Clara too are responding, any orgs that provide trainings or local Seattle training resources in how to implement this in our organizations, possibly in our personal lives as well. Also local resources in healing for previously incarcerated folks and their families. Collective Justice does that. Rooted Reentry and Freedom Project. Martina put Wall Block, Rainier Beach Action Coalition, EPI Chaya, and Collective Justice also do those trainings. And I'll try to, if you got information about this panel from someone besides me, if you'll put your email in the chat, I'll make sure to send a follow-up email. And if I don't, I'll have to do some sleuthing to find it, but we'll make sure to put resources on the website as well. Just to expand off of that, since RJ requires both parties to show up in a way, what would each of you say of like, what does a process of healing look like when you don't get that? When you don't maybe, I don't know, get that acknowledgement, or maybe your idea of justice, you never see that because you don't get an opportunity like that. I know Whitney, like especially working within the justice system, that you are operating within another system that requires, like, because of legal things, of laws and police and the prosecutor's office, like all of those things, and you're having to work within the systems. But I'm curious if, yeah, just what your thoughts would be on that. What if both people aren't willing to show up? What does a process of healing look like?
I think what's most important is reaching out, extending the offer, the invitation to figure out what kind of process or format or structure can be created to meet the needs of those most involved in a situation. It's restorative justice isn't a one size fits all. It's not the same number of people in every session. It's not, there's oftentimes, most often reference to circles, but the shape can look different. You can also hear about conferences, panels, mediation in some way, shape, or form can be a restorative process. So not tying yourselves to just one particular format or structure. But first and foremost, extend the offer, communicate that restorative justice is an option, it's available. I think that is counter to our retributive system that outright fails so many survivors, victims, impacted, harmed parties by not even including them or reaching out, communicating in any way. And I'm just kind of keeping my eye on the chat. And I agree. But RJ, it's voluntary. You don't want to force anybody into a restorative process. I feel like that's a little counterintuitive, right? Like you're not going to get the most meaningful result if somebody's feeling forced into it. So you try to meet needs, you try to address concerns, answer questions, adapt as you can for those involved. But some folks choose not to participate or can't participate for some reason. Within CYS, we still have community representatives who don't necessarily play the role of the victim or pretend that they were on the receiving end of the harm that was caused, but they're representing the larger community so that that person, that young person who was responsible for the harm can still see that folks care about them, that there is a space for this type of accountability, conversation, and reparations to happen, that we're not just focused, although extremely important, on repairing the harm to those that were harmed, victims, survivors, but we're repairing and restoring the responsible person too, that they're able to go back to a community, to an organization, to their family, without the full weight of that incident for the rest of their life, without the labels that have been attached to them. So if there are other folks that can still speak to or represent kind of the ripple effect of a harm or a conflict that occurred, I think that that's still a meaningful process. We see the results of it in CYS, that just as much reparation occurs in those types of RJ processes that we facilitate, that youth who participate, they, at the same level, they're just as less likely to hurt and harm in the future when they're meeting with a community member and not their direct victim or harm party. So it is possible, but ideally you're getting those most involved or most impacted.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and that being a process of remembering to center the person that has been most impacted by that harm. And oh gosh, I think it was Mimi Kim that I was listening to, who was talking about just like what she's learned, and saying things like survivor centered, and that might change and adapt. Your idea of like what centering means might be very different than what that person needs, and that maybe the options I'm giving to you are not good options, which is why kind of when I mention things like, I would have loved for an experience of accountability or acknowledgement of harm to be like, here are ideas, our our ideas? How do they feel for you? Do you have different needs? Like, I want input. I'm not putting all the labor on you. I want to share what my ideas are, but maybe that's not like I'm trying to send your needs, but maybe what I have offered you isn't actually what you need. And I love that I hadn't thought about that when she mentioned that in that specific way. What does that look like in the process? And I just think that that's an important thing to acknowledge. Clara, did you want to add onto that? You don't have to.
I do, and I don't, only because my train of thought is going so fast that I haven't quite caught up with it yet. So
That's okay.
soon.
Whenever you want to, you chime in. I know that we're coming up at time. It's about to be 6:30, like in a minute. But just some lasting things that I first, just extreme gratitude. I am so just again honored to share space with all of you. And this will not be the last conversation that we have. This is a series that SACA is doing. We're going to continue to have panelists from all over come and share about their work and how you can apply it. How can you start? It doesn't have to be like we have to create this whole brand new policy and everybody needs training, and like hopefully you get to a place where you're able to have more support, maybe a little bit more of a structure or a process around what that looks like. But how can we take these things and apply them to our own lives, and then and to our organizations also, where we're willing to grow and to stretch. My hope is that, we saw a lot over the past couple of years, arts and culture organizations get called out in very public ways. And what I noticed was that if I was in a room with other executive leaders, and obviously that executive leader or that organization or people that were a part of that organization weren't in the room, nobody talked about it. Everybody knew about it, but nobody talked about it. And it was an opportunity for me that I love discomfort, not in my personal life, but in my work life, I love discomfort. And it was such a funny space to be like, hey, nobody's talking about this, so I'm going to bring it up. And one of the things that I want us to take is that what Clara and Martina and Whitney and Dr. Bandhead all shared was like this very pivotal, important thing of like, you are not the harm you cause, like not being thrown away. People don't deserve to be thrown away. And what does a process look like when harm happens, because it's going to? What does it look like to support that person back into community? What are the ways that we need to make amends for that? What are the practices that we need to take on as individuals? But how can we also make sure that we're not like, at least that's not me. I'm over here. I'm a good person. I don't cause harm, or whatever we're holding ourselves up to be, and just end up ostracizing other people. And I saw a lot of that in the arts. I saw a lot of that in a lot of different places, but in the arts and culture sector, that showed up a lot. And just really wanting to, like, harm continues to happen regardless of the work our organizations have done. How can we not just, how can we not create something different and try something different? Clara, did you want to speak up? Do you want me to say them?
I'll read it. I'm sure you'd like to take a voice break. So, but it also really helps me to write out what I'm saying, because I am also neurodivergent. So it's like, oh, I got to see what I'm going to say. So it makes sense. But anyhow, so two things came to mind in regards to your last question, Alina. And so one is consent, and the other is to ask. Often we walk into conversations with assumptions of what others need. And so when we ask folks what they need to heal, we're giving them an opportunity to voice those needs, which gives us an opportunity to connect and to build or mend that relationship in the process. And then also being clear and asking specifically if somebody needs support, or do they just want to be heard? Do you just want to vent to me right now and just let it all air out? Or do you need me to hold you through this and offer you my support? And what does that look like for you? because it's different for everybody, right? Restorative justice can be done in so many different ways, like Whitney was saying, and it can manifest in so many different ways for just one single person too, right? So I think those two things specifically can really help us not just embody this practice, but really put it into practice in our day to day and even at work too. So yeah, thinking about consent and asking specifically if one needs support or if they just need to be heard.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I can't imagine a better way to end. I will follow up with the panelists and ask for resources so that we can distribute those out via the MailChimp. If you're not signed up for the SACA newsletter, please go to the website and sign up. But I'll make sure that we'll post on our socials on Instagram, and we'll have those resources up on our website as well. I'm curious if you have capacity and you're able, I wanted to switch to gallery view and just, if you have your camera, if you could turn your camera on and just express some gratitude for all the panelists. You can do emojis if you want to, but just wanted to say thank you so much. We've had such a diverse group of people here, and it's so wonderful to see all of you in your face. Thank you for coming. I'm going to stay on for a minute. So if I didn't get your email and you want to stay connected for the series or for SACA, make sure that I have your email, drop it in the chat, and we'll make sure to share everything out. But everybody, thank you so much for being here. Martina, Whitney, Clara, Alina, the other ASL interpreter. It is so weird saying that. And Jinah, thank you so much. So grateful to each of you. All right, everybody. Have a good night. Bye.